Hey, this is Eddie Hyatt. This is the Awakening Podcast. I'm so glad you've joined me today. This week, our theme is going to be the war on America's Christian past. Yes, there is an all-out war by evil forces in America today that wants to destroy America's Christian past because they realize that the only way they can radically transform America into a Marxist socialist society and nation is to destroy America's Christian past. Because you see, a nation derives its sense of identity, of who it is, from its past, from its history. That is why that is why George Orwell, in his classic book, 1984, said, "Whoever controls the past controls the future." If you want to radically transform a nation, you've got to tamper with their past and revise and change their past and cut them off from their true past. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a Russian who spent 8 years in a Soviet labor camp because of his opposition to the Marxists and communists. He later was released and immigrated to America, won a Nobel Prize in the area of literature for his work documenting and writing about the Soviet labor camp systems. And he made this statement. He observed how the Marxists sought to cut off the Russian people from their Christian past. And he said, to destroy a people, you must first sever their roots. And there is an all-out attempt today by certain segments of American society, an all-out attempt to sever this generation from our Christian roots. And it is so that they can more easily and radically transform America into their own image. And Karl Marx, he understood this because Karl Marx said, people without a heritage are easily persuaded. Wow. You've heard of the 1619 Project. The 1619 Project is a Marxist attempt to destroy America's Christian heritage so that the nation can be more easily molded and transformed into a modern Marxist secularist sort of state. So our subject this week is so very important. The war on America's Christian past. Now, I was already aware of this. Just think of all the attacks we hear about all the time, and so many we don't hear about that don't make the news. Continual lawsuits by secularists and atheistic organizations trying to remove every vestige of Christian expression from the public square. Lawsuits seeking to remove crosses from public places, seeking to remove Ten Commandment displays. Just not too long ago, in Oklahoma, there in the Bible Belt, in Oklahoma City, at the state capitol, because of a lawsuit by a secularist group, a Ten Commandment display on the Capitol grounds was removed by the order of a federal judge. And there is this continual battle going on to destroy America's Christian heritage. Because as Karl Marx said, people without a heritage are easily persuaded. And so our theme this week is so very important. The war on America's Christian heritage. The war on America's Christian past. And I was aware of this already, but then not last year, but in 1619, during the summer of 1619, I became deeply stirred in my heart to take a book that I had written and published in 2012 called America's Revival Heritage. And that book came out of another experience, spiritual experience, a visitation from God that I will share in a succeeding podcast. But that book was published in 2012, America's Revival Heritage, and it documented how that the first great awakening in colonial America had a direct bearing on the founding of this nation. The Great Awakening, which occurred, I date it from 1726 to 1770. It was a powerful Christian renewal, revival. Entire towns repented and turned to God. The populace was transformed. Racial and cultural barriers were breached. Blacks and whites turned to Christ, by the tens of thousands. It was incredible. Let me just go ahead and I'll just read to you how Benjamin Franklin, one of America's founding fathers, how he described this awakening when it came to his hometown of Philadelphia. And Benjamin Franklin, in his autobiography, he described the transformation that took place, particularly when a young British evangelist named George Whitefield, who was in his 20s, he had had a radical new birth and transformation of his life through Jesus Christ. And he was ordained with the Anglican Church, but he had become a part of the Methodist revival. This was before Methodism was a church. It was a revival movement, and led by him and the Wesley brothers, John and Charles. Whitefield was having great success preaching in Great Britain, but he felt a very stirring call to come to colonial America and preach the gospel. And so he preached all up and down the eastern seaboard with incredible results everywhere he went. And Benjamin Franklin recorded what happened when George Whitefield came to his hometown of Philadelphia. Franklin said the multitudes of all sects and denominations that attended his sermons were enormous. And it was a matter of speculation to me, who was one of the number, to observe the extraordinary influence of his oratory on his hearers. From being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town in an evening without hearing psalms sung in different families of every street. That description is why it was called a Great Awakening. This was not just a little happy, emotional, hyped up religious event in a church building. The entire community, the entire city of Philadelphia was transformed. So much that Franklin said you can walk down the street in Philadelphia and you will hear people singing and praising God coming from houses on every street. Wow. And so this book that I published in 2012, America's Revival Heritage, it documented how this Great Awakening affected, to one degree or another, every one of America's founders, and had a direct bearing on the founding of America. I printed 2,000 copies. They sold out, but I had not reprinted it. And in 2019, I had this deep stirring to take that book, to edit it, to add research that I had come upon, that I had discovered since it was published in 2012. And I was stirred in my heart to add a chapter on slavery and to show how this Great Awakening not only had a direct bearing on the founding of America, but also had a direct bearing on the abolition and the elimination of slavery on this continent. Wow. And so after I started this project, I felt that God led me providentially to research that I had never seen before of this great, powerful abolition movement that arose in the 1700s out of this Great Awakening, and how it had such an impact on colonial America and all of America's founders, and turned all of America's founders against slavery. And I was so excited about this. In the midst of this research, I read about the 1619 Project of the New York Times, which was weekly publications about slavery in America in commemoration of the first African slaves being brought to America in 1619. Now, I went to their website, the 1619 website, and they stated up front that their purpose was to reframe American history. And they were insisting that America was not founded in 1776, that America was founded in 1619, when those first African slaves were brought to America. and that slavery defined America. And therefore, America is racist and evil and corrupt at its very core, and therefore in need of radical transformation. Do you see what is happening here? What is behind this reframing of American history? It is a Marxist vision to radically transform contemporary America into a socialist Marxist state. But they have to reframe. They have to rewrite and revise America's history and destroy America's Christian past and to destroy the truth about about the Christian influence on the ending of slavery on this continent and the influence on the founding of America. And so when I was reading that, I was right in the midst of writing this book, and my response was, no, America was not defined by 1619. America was defined by 1726. That was the year the Great Awakening began. And yes, slavery is a horrible thing. And 1619 could have defined America. But as that patriotic hymn says, America, America, God shed His grace on thee. And in 1726, in response to the prayers of a remnant of inhabitants of colonial America, God began to pour out His Spirit in incredible ways that we can hardly imagine. Entire towns, as Benjamin Franklin described, repenting and turning to God. Out of this movement, there came a powerful anti-slavery abolition movement that was unique to the world at that time. You see, the bringing of slaves to America in 1619, there was nothing really different or unique about that because slavery was accepted and practiced in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, and throughout the world. But what was unique about slavery in America was this abolition movement that arose up against it. Here's a quote in my book, 1726. I hope you'll get a copy for yourself and your pastor and for political leaders in your community. And one of the great scholars of our times, Dr. Thomas Sowell, who happens to be an African American, this is a quote in the book 1726. He says, slavery was just not an issue, not even among intellectuals, much less among political leaders, until the 18th century. And then it was an issue only in Western civilization. Why? Because of the influence of Christianity. He says, among those who turned against slavery in the 18th century were George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and other American leaders. You could research all of 18th century Africa or Asia or the Middle East without finding any comparable rejection of slavery there. Yes, slavery was unique in America because of the moral outrage that arose up against it that was not happening in Africa, in Asia, and the Middle East. It was happening in other countries of Western civilization, but it was particularly happening in America. Why was it happening in America? It was happening because of this great spiritual awakening that was taking place, that would have a direct bearing on the founding of this great nation and a direct bearing on the ending of slavery on this continent. Oh, my friends, how we need to recover and hold on to and preserve our Christian heritage. Our future generations depend on us preserving our Christian heritage. I'm Eddie Hyatt. This is the Awakening Podcast, and we're going to continue our discussion of the war on America's Christian past when we come back tomorrow. I hope to see you then.